Code red. 2 fingers on the chest. Confirm extraction immediately. You're gonna be okay. Hang in there.
Put her on the overflow wave. Let's see how she manages a code she can't even hear coming. The words moved across Denise Pruitt's lips in the charge nurse break room at Ridgeline Regional Medical Center in Missoula, Montana, at 2:14 in the afternoon, spoken low and certain to a resident who nodded along like he was agreeing to something reasonable. Naomi Colby did not hear a syllable of it. She read it instead, from 11 feet away, through the reflection in the stainless steel medication cabinet, angled just enough to catch the break room doorway. A habit she'd built so long ago, she no longer thought of it as a skill, only as a way of moving through a world that rarely thought to face her when it spoke. She kept walking. She kept her expression the same unreadable calm she wore into every trauma bay, and on her right forearm, beneath the rolled cuff of her scrub sleeve, a faded tattoo of a small black arrowhead caught the corridor light, a mark she had never once explained to anyone at Ridgeline, because no one had ever asked, and she had never given them a reason to. Denise Pruitt did not know what that arrowhead meant. Neither did Dr. Colin Ashby, the resident nodding along in the break room, filing the plan away as a reasonable piece of triage logistics rather than what it actually was. But down the hallway, in the ambulance bay doorway, a hospital security guard named Ray Delgado, a former Army corpsman who noticed things other people didn't, had caught the tail end of the conversation through the open door, and something in his face had gone very still. A trauma nurse the staff had spent 8 months deciding was a liability, a woman the hospital was about to lose the privilege of underestimating in the worst possible week to try. If you've never heard a story like this before, I'd invite you to stay for this one. It's the kind that sits with you. And if this is your first time here, consider sticking around and subscribing. This channel exists for the people the world walked past without ever asking who they really were. Now, let's get into it. 3 hours before Denise Pruitt said those words in the break room, the trauma floor at Ridgeline had not slowed down for a Tuesday. It rarely did, not in a county hospital serving a stretch of Montana highway that saw more overturned trucks and hunting accidents than most people expected. Naomi had come on shift at 6 that morning, and by the time the light through the ambulance bay windows turned the color of weak tea, she had already worked 2 codes, stabilized a farming accident with a degloving injury to the hand, and caught a subtle drop in a post-op patient's oxygen saturation that the monitor hadn't flagged yet because the sensor had slipped half a centimeter off the fingertip. She noticed it because she was watching the patient's chest rise and fall, the way she always watched things, closely, continuously, the way a person watches when sound isn't available to fill in the gaps. She moved through the department with a particular economy that the younger staff noticed and mostly misread. She never startled at a crash cart being wheeled in behind her, never flinched at an alarm going off 2 bays over, and it unsettled people in a building built on sudden noise, the sense that nothing about her reacted the way theirs did. A second-year nurse named Ben Ferris had once asked another tech, half joking, whether Colby ever got surprised by anything, and the tech had shrugged, because nobody had a real answer, and nobody had thought to ask Naomi herself, and Naomi had never offered one. She read lips with a fluency built over decades, close enough to real time that most people forgot, within a few shifts of working with her, that she was doing it at all. She wore 2 hearing aids that gave her a partial, textured sense of the loudest sounds in a room, a monitor's tone, a raised voice, the low mechanical growl of the ambulance bay doors, but the fine detail, the words themselves, she took from faces, from the specific shapes mouths made, and the timing of them, a language she had taught herself to read the way other people read a page. She kept a small laminated card clipped to her badge that read, simply, "I am deaf. Face me when you speak. I read lips." Most of the staff had stopped needing it months ago. A few, including Denise Pruitt, had never quite adjusted and treated the accommodation less as a fact to work around and more as an inconvenience to tolerate. There was a rhythm to the way Naomi worked a room that had nothing to do with hospital training and everything to do with something older. She positioned herself, without thinking about it, so that she always had a clear sight line to every doorway and every face that might need her attention. She noticed the small vibrations a crash cart made through the floor tile before she noticed the cart itself, a sensitivity she'd built out of necessity that most of her colleagues never registered she had. She kept a battered spiral notebook in her scrub pocket, not for patient notes but for herself, 3 or 4 words jotted at odd moments. Check Grissom's pressure, recheck Bay9 dressing, a habit that had started long before Ridgeline. As a way of keeping track of things a ringing set of ears couldn't reliably hold on to. She was not unfriendly. She brought in banana bread on Sundays, a small, genuine gesture toward the people she spent 12-hour shifts beside, and she'd learned, patiently and without complaint, which of her co-workers remembered to face her when they spoke, and which needed a gentle tap on the shoulder to be reminded. But there was a boundary a few steps.
After helping hundreds of people improve their sleep, I created a simple guide that shows the habits and techniques that can help you sleep more deeply. Click the link pinned in the comments to get the guide.
Steps past friendliness that no one at Ridgeline had ever quite crossed, a place where an older life lived, and the people who worked with her long enough learned, without being told outright, not to reach for it. What none of them knew, not the residents, not the charge nurses, not the patients who assumed her calm was simply a personality trait and nothing more, was that 4 years earlier, Naomi Colby had served an entirely different kind of shift, in an entirely different kind of uniform. She had been Sergeant First Class Naomi R. Colby then, 75th Ranger Regiment, a combat medic attached to a direct action company running night operations in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. 11 months into that deployment, a roadside device detonated 40 meters from the lead vehicle in her convoy, close enough to concuss her, far enough that she survived it, and the blast took the hearing in both ears almost entirely within seconds, a sound so total it had, in its way, gone silent almost immediately, replaced by a high, thin ringing that never fully left her. She had continued working the casualties in front of her anyway, reading the shapes of her platoon mates' mouths through blood and dust, running triage on 4 wounded men, using a system of hand signals she improvised on the spot because there had been no time to ask permission to invent one, a rapid sequence of finger positions against the sternum that meant airway, meant bleeding, meant clear, meant wait. The system worked. It worked so well that the battalion adopted a modified version of it for low-visibility night operations, and for years afterward, rangers who had never met her called it, without knowing whose hands had built it, Colby's Code. She earned a call sign in the after-action review that followed, one that stuck through the medical board that eventually discharged her. Vain, small, quiet, easy for people to walk past without noticing it meant anything at all. A name that had, in a narrow circle of operators and command staff, come to mean something close to trust itself. The convoy that night had no working radios for nearly 20 minutes after the blast, the electronics fried by the same detonation that took her hearing, and for those 20 minutes, the platoon ran entirely on the code she was inventing in real time. 4 wounded men and a handful of uninjured soldiers who had never signed anything more complicated than a thumbs-up learning an entire triage language from a woman who couldn't hear her own voice explaining it. She remembered the dust most clearly, the particular orange-gray of it hanging in the headlights, and the strange, total quiet where noise should have been, a silence that had nothing peaceful in it and everything urgent. She did not remember being afraid in any way she could describe cleanly. She remembered counting, breaths, finger taps, the 4 faces in front of her, and the order in which each one needed her hands, and beneath all of it, a stillness that only arrives when there's no room left for anything but the next necessary motion. She did not talk about Helmand, and it was not because the memory was too painful to touch, though there were nights it visited her anyway, usually in the particular hour before dawn, when the hospital hallways went quiet enough that the ringing in her ears became the loudest thing in the room. It was because she had learned in the years since that telling people made them treat her differently in two directions at once, either with an exaggerated, performative gentleness that assumed she'd broken, or with a skepticism that assumed she was exaggerating, that deaf and combat medic didn't belong in the same sentence, and she had grown tired of managing other people's disbelief. She had built a quiet life at Ridgeline, where she was simply Naomi, capable, exacting, easy to overlook in the specific way she'd come to prefer, and she guarded that ordinariness carefully, the way some people guard a fortune, not because she was ashamed of Hellmand, because she had already given that convoy 11 months and both her ears, and she wasn't interested in handing it anything more. Denise Pruitt had run the day shift at Ridgeline for 11 years, and she was not, by any honest account, a cruel person. She believed, with the kind of conviction that had calcified slowly over more than a decade, that a trauma floor ran safely only when every nurse could respond instantly to spoken instruction across a chaotic room, and she had built her entire operational philosophy around that single assumption, reinforced by a code years earlier where a critical order had been missed in the noise and a patient had coded before anyone caught it. She had never fully processed that memory. She had instead built a floor management style shaped entirely around preventing it from happening again, and somewhere in that process, a reasonable caution had calcified into something closer to prejudice, a quiet, unexamined belief that Naomi Colby's deafness made her a liability the department was simply choosing, out of politeness, not to say out loud. She had a habit, small and mostly unconscious, of assigning Naomi the department's calmer bays and routing the loud, fast-moving trauma cases to other nurses.
After helping hundreds of people improve their sleep, I created a simple guide that shows the habits and techniques that can help you sleep more deeply. Click the link pinned in the comments to get the guide.
Nurses, a soft form of exclusion she told herself was consideration. She was not the kind of person who thought of herself as unkind, and by most measures she wasn't. She remembered nurses' birthdays, covered shifts without being asked, defended her staff fiercely to hospital administration when budget cuts threatened their hours. Her blind spot was narrower than her character, which was, in its way, what made it so durable. She had built her entire professional identity on the conviction that she could see a flaw clearly enough to keep everyone on it safe, and admitting that her judgment about one particular nurse had calcified into something closer to bias would have meant admitting the floor she'd run so carefully for 11 years had a fault line running straight through her own certainty. That Tuesday, the inciting moment arrived quietly, the way it usually did. A 17-year-old boy named Tyler Grissom was wheeled in following a highway collision, his abdomen rigid and his blood pressure sliding in a way the monitors hadn't yet caught. Naomi noticed it first, not from a beeping alarm, but from the particular grey cast spreading across his face and the shallow, rapid rise of his chest, details she had learned to read as fluently as any sound. She flagged the resident with 2 fingers tapped against her own sternum, a habit so old it was reflex, and when he didn't understand the gesture, she simply moved, calling for an ultrasound and a surgical consult before anyone else in the bay had registered how quickly Tyler Grissom was bleeding internally. She stepped back the moment the trauma surgeon arrived, letting the credit flow exactly where the hospital's structure expected it to. Only Ray Delgado, watching from the ambulance bay doorway, where he'd wandered on a routine patrol, registered what had actually happened. A nurse catching an internal bleed with her eyes alone, faster than the monitors had, and saying nothing about it afterward. It was 2 hours later, once Tyler Grissom was in surgery and stable, that Denise Pruitt and Dr. Colin Ashby stood in the break room drawing up the following week's mass casualty drill assignments. A scheduled hospital-wide exercise simulating a multi-vehicle highway incident, complete with live radio calls, overlapping alarms, and shouted triage commands across a chaotic simulated bay. "Put her on the overflow wave," Denise said, her voice low and certain. "Let's see how she manages a code she can't even hear coming. Maybe it finally gets someone upstairs to admit what the rest of us have been dancing around for a year." Ashby nodded, uneasy but compliant, the particular compliance of a young doctor who hadn't yet learned to say no to the person who controlled his schedule. Naomi read the exchange from across the room, in the reflection off the medication cabinet, without either of them realizing she'd caught a word of it. 3 days later, the day of the drill arrived, and it was not, in the end, a drill. At 11:52 that morning, a real multi-vehicle collision on Highway 93 sent Ridgeline's ambulance bay into the exact chaos the exercise had been designed to simulate. 5 patients inbound, within 4 minutes of each other, radios overlapping, alarms sounding from 3 directions, exactly the storm Denise Pruitt had built to expose a weakness she was certain existed. Naomi was assigned to the overflow wave as planned, the loudest, fastest-moving corner of a floor that had, by design, stopped accommodating her. "You can't run triage in a room like this," Denise said, finding Naomi at the edge of the bay as the first ambulance doors opened. "I need someone who can hear the radio calls, Naomi. This isn't personal. I read the manifest board the second it updates," Naomi said, her voice level, the particular calm of someone accustomed to being doubted in a crisis. "I don't need to hear the radio to see which patient is crashing." "You'll miss something," Denise pressed, her jaw tight. "And when you do, it's not just your license on the line, it's a patient's life." "I've run worse rooms than this one," Naomi said. "Assign me the wave. I'll show you." "You always do this," Denise said, something underneath the frustration cracking open into something older, something closer to a decade-old fear than to genuine concern for the patients in front of them. "You act like the accommodation is an insult every time someone tries to protect the department." "I've watched a room like this fall apart before, Naomi. I'm not willing to watch it happen again because I let pride make the call instead of caution." "This isn't pride," Naomi said, still level, still not raising her voice to match Denise's. "It's 11 years of you deciding what I'm capable of without ever actually watching me work a room like this one. I've earned the chance to show you different." Denise did not soften. "I already assigned it as a test, and I'm not changing my mind now because you're offended by it." Naomi went still, not defensive, not rattled, simply still, the particular stillness of someone who had stood in far louder rooms than this one, and found, every time, that stillness read clearer than volume ever could. It did not argue. It didn't need to. Something about it landed in the part of the room that recognized, without being able to name it, the presence of someone who had already survived the worst version of exactly this kind of chaos. Denise opened her mouth to escalate, a formal incident note, the words already forming, when the ambulance bay doors slammed open on a convoy that hadn't been called for. 3 military Humvees pulled into the bay in tight formation, engines still running, and before the first vehicle had fully stopped, a command sergeant major in Army combat fatigues was already out of the passenger seat, moving fast toward the entrance with a wounded ranger slung across 2 soldiers' shoulders behind him. His eyes swept the bay once, fast, the practiced scan of someone assessing a room for threats and casualties in the same glance, and then they landed on Naomi and stopped moving entirely. He stood 3 feet from her for a full second without speaking, without breaking stride's momentum in any visible way, except that his stride had simply ceased. His gaze fixed on the badge at her chest, then on the faded arrowhead visible where her sleeve had ridden up during the shift, and something in his face shifted from urgency to recognition so fast it looked, to everyone watching, like the room itself had changed shape around him. "Vane," he said. He did not shout it. He signed it at the same time. 2 fingers tapped once against his own sternum, the exact gesture she'd built 4 years earlier, in a different desert, in a different kind of emergency. "I served under Colonel Reyes when they wrote up Colby's code. I've spent 2 years hoping I'd get the chance to shake the hand that built the thing that saved half my platoon since." The room did not simply go quiet, it reconfigured, the way a photograph reorganizes itself once someone tells you what you're looking at. Denise Pruitt's certainty, so absolute 30 seconds earlier, evaporated without a single word of public correction. She simply understood, watching a Ranger Sergeant Major sign a code sequence to a hospital trauma nurse in the middle of her own overflow wave, that she had misjudged the woman standing in front of her for 11 years running. "I've got a wounded operator and 4 more inbound from a live fire training incident at the range outside town," the Sergeant Major said, turning to the department with the crisp economy of a man used to briefing rooms. "I requested this hospital specifically because Sergeant Colby's file listed combat trauma triage experience under exactly these conditions. I need her running this wave, ma'am, if you have no objection." Denise looked at Naomi for a long moment, not the look of someone defending her authority, but the look of a person recalculating everything she thought she knew. "No objection," she said quietly. The next hour belonged to Naomi Colby in a way no shift at Ridgeline ever had. 5 patients came through the bay in overlapping waves, Tyler Grissom's highway collision cascading alongside the wounded Rangers from the live fire incident, and Naomi ran triage across all of it, without a single spoken radio call reaching her. Using a visual manifest board she reorganized on site, hand signals relayed instantly to 2 techs she'd trained in Colby's code within the first 90 seconds of the crisis, and a pace that outstripped every nurse working beside her. The first decision was Corporal Andres Ruiz, the operator carried in first, whose entry wound Naomi read by its bruising pattern rather than its trajectory alone. Most of the trauma team, looking at the wound in isolation.
After helping hundreds of people improve their sleep, I created a simple guide that shows the habits and techniques that can help you sleep more deeply. Click the link pinned in the comments to get the guide.
Would have assumed a clean, straight path and prepped the surgical approach accordingly. Naomi caught the faint, asymmetric discoloration spreading outward from the entry site, a detail most people would have dismissed as incidental swelling, and recognized a deflection off the 4th rib before the round had continued inward, a call built from years of reading wounds in places with no imaging equipment available at all, where pattern recognition was the only diagnostic tool that mattered. She signed it to the surgical resident in 3 quick gestures rather than saying it aloud, and moved on before anyone thought to ask how she knew. The second decision came 6 minutes later, when Ruiz's blood pressure began sliding in a pattern the monitor read as simple blood loss, but that Naomi recognized, from the shallow, uneven rise of his chest, as a developing tension pneumothorax. She signaled for a needle decompression before the numbers had fully caught up to what her eyes had already told her, and the surgical team held its breath for the several seconds it took to confirm she was right. It was the kind of call that only comes from having made it before, more than once, in a place where a wrong guess carried no second attempt. The third decision was Tyler Grissom's, unfolding almost simultaneously 2 bays over. His surgical team, mid-procedure, hadn't yet caught the second drop in his blood pressure. Naomi had, watching through the OR window from across the corridor, and she wrote it on a whiteboard marker in 6 words held flat against the glass. "Pressure dropping again. Check the splenic bleed." The surgeon inside glanced up, read it, and redirected the procedure within 90 seconds, a correction that likely bought Grissom 4 critical minutes his surgical team hadn't known they were losing. The fourth decision was quieter and had nothing to do with a wound at all. Ben Ferris, the second-year nurse, had frozen at the sight of Ruiz's injury, hands shaking over a suction line he didn't yet know how to hold steady under real pressure. Naomi placed 2 fingers briefly against his forearm, a tap, a beat, the same signal she'd taught him not 20 minutes earlier, and mouthed, slowly and clearly, "Breathe, then work." His hands steadied within seconds, and he would say afterward that he'd never forget the exact rhythm of that tap, because it was the first time anyone had ever calmed him down without saying a single audible word. Dr. Colin Ashby, for his part, did something he had not done in 3 years at Ridgeline. He stopped waiting to be told what to do, and started reading Naomi's hands, the way the sergeant major had, following her signals into decisions before she'd finished making them, anticipating her next request, and having the instrument ready before she reached for it. Something in his face had shifted. Not embarrassment exactly, but the quiet, internal recalibration of a young doctor, realizing the nurse he'd helped sideline 3 days earlier had just run a 5-patient mass casualty wave more precisely than anyone else on the floor. At one point, without being asked, he pulled a second suction line himself, rather than paging for a tech, a small, unremarkable act that would have been beneath his attention 3 days before. Denise Pruitt watched from the edge of the bay, saying nothing at all, her clipboard held against her chest, like something she'd forgotten how to use. She would later describe that hour, to no one in particular, as the longest silence of her professional life. Not because the bay was quiet, but because she had spent it finally listening, in the only way that mattered, to a nurse she'd spent 11 years talking over. By 1:40 that afternoon, all 5 patients were stable. Naomi stepped back from the manifest board the moment the last handoff was complete, disappearing from the center of the room before anyone could turn the moment into something about her. The command sergeant major found her 20 minutes later restocking a supply cart in the instrument room, her hands still moving with the leftover momentum of the last hour. "You didn't have to take that wave," he said, signing it as he spoke, out of what she recognized immediately as habit rather than performance. They needed someone who could read a bleed pattern faster than a monitor could confirm it, Naomi signed back. "I was already here." "Reyes used to say that about you," he said, a tired warmth in it. "Said half the reason the platoon trusted your calls wasn't just the medicine, it was that you never once acted like being needed was a burden." Naomi's hands stilled on the cart for a moment. "It wasn't. It still isn't. It's just not the whole of who I am anymore, and I built a life carefully enough that I'd like to keep that distinction." He set something on the counter beside her hands, a challenge coin, the edges worn soft from years in someone's pocket. "Command wanted you to have this. It's 2 years overdue." She looked at it for a long moment before picking it up. "I'm not her anymore, not the way you mean it." "I'd argue," he signed, gently, without pressing it further, "but I understand the line you're drawing." "It's not shame," she said. "It's that the woman who built that code and the woman standing here aren't the same person anymore, and I worked hard for that difference to matter. I'm a nurse. That's not smaller than what I was. It's just different." He nodded once, the nod of a man who'd heard versions of that sentence from other people who came home from the same kinds of places. "Understood, Sergeant. For what it's worth, Ruiz is alive because of the woman in this room right now, not just the one from 4 years ago. Maybe they're not as separate as you think." He left it there. Denise Pruitt found Naomi an hour later, alone at the charge station, updating Tyler Grissom's chart with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. She faced Naomi fully before she spoke, something she hadn't consistently done in 11 years. "I was wrong about you," she said simply. "Not just this week. I think I've been wrong for longer than that, and I let a bad memory from years ago decide how I saw you instead of actually looking." Naomi looked up, and something in her expression didn't quite soften, but it opened a fraction. "You run a tight floor, Denise," she signed. "You don't have to be wrong about everything to have been wrong about one thing." Denise nodded, and it was enough. Neither needed the moment to be bigger than it was. Ben Ferris found her near the supply closet before the end of the shift and asked, quietly, if she'd teach him more of the signal system properly, not as an accommodation, but because he'd watched it work faster than anything he'd learned in nursing school. She said yes. By 3:30 that afternoon, Naomi Colby had picked her chart back up. She checked Tyler Grissom's post-op vitals, adjusted a monitor that had been flagged too sensitive, and walked the floor the way she always did. Unhurried, deliberate, entirely unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. The department moved around her the way it always had, indifferent and continuous, full of people who had no idea what had happened in the ambulance bay 4 hours earlier, and no reason to ever find out. She had never needed them to know. She needed, simply, to be somewhere she was useful, and after everything, Helmand, the years of quiet, the break room conspiracy, the coin now sitting in a drawer at home she wasn't sure she'd ever open again, she still knew exactly where that was. There's something in Naomi Colby's story that stays with you long after it ends, and it isn't really about call signs or convoys or the particular drama of a Ranger Sergeant Major signing a code sequence in a hospital ambulance bay. It's about how quickly we decide what a person is capable of based on the one thing about them we've decided to measure: a diagnosis, a disability, a quiet voice in a loud room, and how rarely we go back to check our math once we've made up our minds. Denise Pruitt looked at Naomi Colby for 11 years and saw a liability shaped by a bad memory that had nothing to do with the woman in front of her, because that reading was easier than doing the harder work of actually watching how she worked. It took a stranger's convoy pulling into an ambulance bay to force a correction Denise should have made herself, a long time ago, simply by paying attention to how steady Naomi's hands stayed when everyone else's shook, how precisely she read a room without a single sound reaching her. The truth is, most of the Naomi Colbys in our own lives never get an ambulance bay moment like this one. Most of them keep restocking the cart and reading the monitor and going home at the end of a shift nobody quite understood, never seen for what they carried, because nobody ever happened to arrive at the right doorway, wearing the right insignia to make the rest of the room finally pay attention. We don't get a convoy showing up to correct the record for most of the quietly capable.
After helping hundreds of people improve their sleep, I created a simple guide that shows the habits and techniques that can help you sleep more deeply. Click the link pinned in the comments to get the guide.
People we underestimate every day. The coworker whose quiet gets mistaken for slowness. The friend whose different way of moving through the world gets read as a limitation instead of simply a different kind of fluency. The person who has already solved a version of today's crisis somewhere we'll never think to ask about. Denise Pruitt's mistake wasn't cruelty. It rarely is. It was the much more common failure of letting one old, unhealed memory stand in for a person she'd actually had 11 years to get to know properly, and never quite finding the moment to set that memory down. Most of us are carrying some version of the same weight, deciding in advance what a person's limitations must be before we've done the harder, slower work of watching them actually work. And maybe the real measure of who we are isn't what happens when the room finally finds out. It's who we already were in all the years before anyone thought to look closely enough. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that quiet competence is still competence, even when the room isn't built to notice it. And if you haven't already, subscribing takes about 2 seconds and means you won't miss what comes next. These stories exist because you keep showing up for them. Thank you.